Oh, let me tell you about the single most catastrophic miscalculation in the history of the Vorrkai Dominion. And trust me, these were not beings known for their good decisions. The Vorrkai had, at various points in their history, declared war on a neutron star, attempted to negotiate with a supernova, and once, and I still laugh about this, tried to tax a black hole. So yes, the bar for bad ideas was already impressively low, but this was something special. It started on a Tuesday. Humans have this thing called Tuesday, which exists specifically so that terrible things have a day to happen on. The Vorrkai fleet dropped out of hyperspace above a small, quiet colony world called Arvenmoor, third moon of the Kassavar system, population 42,000, mostly retired humans. Former soldiers, former engineers, former surgeons, former pilots. People who had, by their own admission, seen enough excitement to last several lifetimes, and had chosen, quite deliberately, to spend their remaining decades drinking something called lemonade on porches and arguing about garden boundaries. Fleet Commander Dros Veth looked at the population census his scouts had forwarded, and actually chuckled. In Vorrkai, chuckling sounds like two rocks being dragged across each other. It is not a pleasant noise. His adjutant, a nervous little creature named Pel Shu, watched his commander review the data and felt, somewhere deep in his secondary stomach, a sensation he would later identify as premonition. Former military, Dros Veth said, waving one of his 4 upper limbs dismissively. Former, old, slow. He set the datapad down. They have no active defenses, no garrison, no standing army. The colony exists outside any protection treaty because it predates the Unified Accord by 6 years, and they are sitting on 3 billion tons of refined corvinium ore that we need for the new expansion fleet. He spread his arms wide. This is not a battle, Pel Shu. This is a shopping trip. Pel Shu said nothing. He just kept feeling that feeling in his secondary stomach. The Vorrkai sent a demand first because they were civilized, technically. A transmission reached Arvenmoor's colony hub at approximately 9 in the morning local time, demanding total surrender, immediate handover of all corvinium stockpiles, and the evacuation of the population within 48 hours. It was signed by Dros Veth personally, with a seal of the Dominion, and it was written in 4 languages, including Human Standard, which Dros Veth considered a generous touch. The colony administrator who received this message was a woman named Odalis Ferreira Tanaka, 71 years old, former Lieutenant General of the 5th Combined Armored Division, veteran of 3 separate interstellar engagements, recipient of the Solar Cross with 2 clusters, and currently, more relevantly, extremely annoyed because someone had let their dog dig up her vegetable garden again, and she had not had her morning tea yet. She read the transmission twice. Then she set her mug down very carefully, because she was not a person who slammed things, and she opened the colony's general communication channel. "Attention, Arvenmoor colony residents," she said, in the same calm, flat tone she had once used to coordinate a fighting retreat across 400 kilometers of hostile terrain. "We have received a hostile ultimatum from a Vorrkai Dominion fleet currently in high orbit. They are demanding surrender and evacuation within 48 hours. Please take note of this." A pause. "Also, whoever owns the brown terrier that has been visiting my garden, please come collect your animal. That's all." She closed the channel. Then she made 3 calls. The first was to a man named Brecken Hollowell, 78, who lived in the Eastern Hills and had spent 31 years as a demolitions and ordnance specialist before retiring to Arvenmoor to pursue competitive woodcarving. Brecken answered on the second ring because Brecken was already awake. Brecken was already awake. Something about decades of pre-dawn military operations had permanently rewired his sleep schedule. "I heard," he said. "I've been waiting for this since I saw their scout ship 3 weeks ago." "You saw their scout ship 3 weeks ago?" Odalis repeated. "Yes, and you didn't feel that was worth mentioning? I figured I'd wait and see if it became a problem." A pause. "It became a problem," Odalis exhaled slowly. "What do you have?" "Enough," Brecken said. "More than enough, honestly. You know how it is." Retired habits. The second call was to a woman named Suki Amara Ose, 66, former cyber systems officer, Navy Intelligence Division, who now ran a small electronics repair shop in the colony's main settlement, and whose backroom contained significantly more interesting things than broken household appliances. Suki had been expecting the call too. She had been running passive intercepts on the Vorrkai fleet since it entered the system, and had in the last 12 hours already mapped their communication frequencies, identified their command ship, cataloged their shield harmonics, and eaten an entire plate of biscuits because stress eating was a thing she had never successfully retired from. "I can blind them," Suki said, by way of greeting. "Not permanently, but long enough." "How long?" 4 minutes, maybe 5 if their tech crew is slow. Which, based on what I'm reading, they are. Odalis allowed herself a small smile. "That'll do." The third call was to a man named Yusuf Dadashev, 83, who had spent 40 years as a trauma surgeon with the mobile field units, and who answered the phone while apparently already in the middle of organizing what sounded like a very large collection of medical supplies. "Already setting up the triage station," he said. "East Community Hall. Marta is helping." Marta was his wife. She was also 83. She had spent 40 years as an anesthesiologist. Together they had kept people alive in conditions that should have been unsurvivable, and they had both long ago developed the particular brand of unflappable competence that comes from having stared at death so many times it had stopped being scary and started just being an administrative problem. "Let's hope you won't need it," Odalis said. "Let's hope," Yusuf agreed, in a tone that suggested hope was a lovely concept and preparation was better. Now up in orbit, Drosveth was waiting for his response. He had given them 48 hours, yes, but he had expected a reply within the first 4 or 5. That was typically how these things worked. You showed up with 20 warships, you sent a strongly worded transmission, and the civilians panicked and started negotiating within the hour. It was a formula. It had worked 17 times in the last decade. At the 12-hour mark, with no reply received, Pel Shu gently suggested they might want to reconsider their assessment of the colony's military capabilities. Drosveth told him to stop worrying. At the 18-hour mark, their long-range sensors detected unusual activity in the colony's northern ore processing sector. Thermal signatures, energy readings, the kind of thing that suggested people were moving equipment around. This was dismissed as evacuation preparations. It was not evacuation preparations. Brecken Hollowell had spent the first 12 hours having extremely productive conversations with 17 other retired veterans who had moved to Arvenmoor specifically because it was quiet, and specifically because they had earned quiet, and who were all, now, discovering to their own mild surprise that they were significantly less retired than they had believed. There was a man named Iko Salazar Webb, 70, who had flown atmospheric combat interceptors for 22 years, and who had, sitting in a barn at the edge of his property, 4 mining survey drones that he had been modifying for the last year as a hobby project. They were not weapons. They had never been weapons. But they had high-power laser cutters for geological sampling. They were remotely piloted, and Iko was very good at flying things. There was a woman named Priya Vashisht, 68, who had served as a signals and electronic warfare specialist, who had been quietly furious about the Vorrkai's casual assumption that because there was no garrison on Arvenmoor, there was therefore nothing dangerous about Arvenmoor, and who had spent the night jury-rigging 4 of the ore processing plant's industrial transmitters into something that was technically still a transmitter, but was now pointed at the sky and generating frequencies that would be deeply unpleasant for Vorrkai sensor arrays. There was a man named Thomas Gereyer Lind, 65, the youngest of the group, who had been a naval combat engineer and who had taken one look at Arvenmoor's geography, deep river valleys, elevated ore deposits, natural choke points around the landing zones, and begun drawing diagrams on his kitchen table with the focused, quiet intensity of someone doing something they are very good at and have missed doing. And there were 31 others. Former infantry, former pilots, former medics, former intelligence officers, former logistics coordinators. People who had, in their working lives, done this professionally. People whose instincts had not gone anywhere, just because they had traded in their uniforms for cardigans. At the 22-hour mark, with still no reply from the colony, Drosveth decided he had been patient enough. He ordered a landing force prepared. 400 Vorrkai shock troopers, standard pacification loadout, 6 atmospheric assault landers. It would take maybe an hour to secure the main settlement. The old humans would see the ships descending, and that would be the end of it. Pel Shu, filling out the deployment authorization forms, paused. "Commander," he said carefully, "their 48-hour window has not yet expired." "I am choosing not to wait," Drosveth said. "The Unified Accord protocols for non-treaty worlds still require—" "Pel Shu, sir, stop." Pel Shu stopped. He completed the forms. He filed them. He then went to his personal station, quietly, and began updating his next-of-kin contact information, because the feeling in his secondary stomach had gotten significantly worse. The landing ships dropped through the atmosphere at dawn, Arvenmoor local time. They were visible from the colony's main settlement as 6 bright streaks cutting through the pale orange sky, dramatic and deliberate, designed to intimidate. Drosveth watched the descent on his command bridge monitors and folded 2 of his 4 upper limbs in satisfaction. In the colony's East Community Hall, Yusuf Dadashev looked up from his supply inventory, watched the streaks through the window, and said to his wife, "Here we go." "Here we go," Marta agreed, handing him a cup of tea, because some habits you maintain regardless. In her colony administrator's office, Odalis Ferreira Tanaka watched the same streaks and picked up her communicator. "All stations," she said. "They're early, we're moving." In a barn on the eastern edge of the colony, Eco Salazar Webb powered up 4 mining drones and cracked his knuckles. In the ore processing plant, Priya Vashist flipped 4 switches in sequence and watched her jury-rigged transmitter array come to life. Its output climbing toward the frequencies she'd calculated would be most effective, and smiled the very specific smile of someone who has done their homework. In a network of old mining tunnels that Tomas Guerrero Lind had spent 18 hours turning into something considerably more tactical, 36 retired veterans checked their equipment, confirmed their positions, and waited. The 6 landing ships touched down in the colony's outer settlement zone, a wide, flat area that their orbital surveys had identified as the most accessible landing ground. 400 Vorrkai shock troopers began to disembark, weapons raised, moving in the standard pacification formation their training had drilled into them. It was very orderly, very professional, very much the formation that Thomas had been counting on them to use, because he had studied Vorrkai tactical doctrine specifically, and their pacification formations had not changed meaningfully in 60 years, and there was a reason experienced soldiers make a point of knowing their enemies' habits. The first thing that happened was that every Vorrkai sensor array within 8 kilometers went dark simultaneously. That was Priya. The second thing that happened was that Eco's 4 mining drones, which had been hovering silently at low altitude behind a ridgeline 3 kilometers away, came screaming over that ridge at full speed and began doing things with their geological laser cutters that their designers had definitely not intended. The Vorrkai formation, suddenly blind, suddenly under fire from directions their sensors couldn't resolve, did what trained soldiers do when things go unexpectedly wrong. They responded. They returned fire. They called for support. They were good at this. The problem, and this is really the part Drosveth should have thought harder about, was that they were good at fighting enemies who made certain predictable assumptions about how a battle should work. Enemies who held territory, enemies who formed lines, enemies who, when outgunned, retreated in a direction that could be followed. Retired soldiers who had spent careers learning exactly how to fight when outgunned, and who had, between them, approximately 2,000 years of combined experience, did not make predictable assumptions. The first Vorrkai squad to reach the colony's main settlement road found it empty. Not abandoned in a hurry empty. Not we heard you coming and ran empty. Deliberately, suspiciously, architecturally empty, in the way that a trap is empty before it stops being empty. Squad leader Veth Khan held up a fist, stopping his 16 soldiers, and looked at the road ahead. It was a wide, flat path between two rows of low colonial buildings, dust-colored walls, wooden porches, the kind of sleepy settlement that should have had elderly humans cowering behind locked doors. Instead, there was nothing. No movement, no sound except wind. Veth Khan had been in 11 pacification operations. He had never once felt uneasy walking into a civilian settlement. He felt uneasy now. "Move up," he ordered anyway, because orders had been given and the formation had to be maintained, and because he told himself he was being irrational. These were old humans, retired. There was nothing to be uneasy about. He had taken approximately 4 steps when the building on his left stopped being a building and became, very briefly, a significant amount of directed explosive force. Brecken Hollowell, watching from a hillside through a handheld scope, made a small note in the margin of his diagram. The blast radius had been slightly larger than estimated. He adjusted his calculations for the next one. He had 11 more prepared. He was, as he had told Odalys, more than enough. The situation on the landing ground had, by this point, become what military analysts would later diplomatically describe as complicated. The 400 shock troopers who had disembarked with such orderly confidence 20 minutes earlier were now operating in complete sensor darkness, under sporadic aerial harassment from ECO's drones, and receiving extremely confusing positional reports from their squad leaders because Tomas's tunnel network had allowed 36 defenders to appear, fire, and disappear from positions that should not have been tactically viable. One of those defenders was a woman named Celestine Maboku Reyes, 69, former infantry staff sergeant, who had been retired for 8 years and who had spent most of those 8 years growing tomatoes and not missing combat at all, thank you very much. Right up until the moment the Vorrkai showed up, at which point she had discovered, with a kind of resigned clarity, that some things you don't actually untrain. Celestine was currently in Tunnel Section 4, which Tomas had designated the eastern flank approach. She had fired twice in the last 10 minutes, relocated both times through passages the Vorrkai didn't know existed, and was now in a completely different position, watching 3 Vorrkai soldiers try to figure out where the shots had come from. They were looking at a rock wall. The shots had not come from the rock wall. They were looking in entirely the wrong direction. She almost felt bad. Almost. She fired again, relocated again, and was 3 tunnels away before they finished turning around. Up in orbit, Dros Veth was having what his species would describe as a difficult morning. The landing force's communication channel was a wall of overlapping reports, none of them good, all of them contradictory, and his sensor officer had just informed him that the jamming affecting the surface units was not, as initially assumed, coming from any detectable installation, but appeared to be emanating from the ore processing plant's existing industrial equipment, which someone had apparently modified in a way that his technical staff were calling unprecedented and his tactical staff were calling a significant problem. "Pull them back," Pelshu said quietly from his station to the left. Dros Veth turned and looked at him. Pelshu, to his own considerable surprise, did not look away. "Commander, with respect, we have taken casualties in a pacification operation against a civilian retirement colony. Our sensors are down, our formation has been broken, and we do not have accurate intelligence on the number or position of active defenders. The tactical situation is not what was assessed." He paused. "Pull them back." The word that Dros Veth used in response to this does not translate cleanly into human standard, but its meaning was approximately, "Absolutely not. I will not be embarrassed by pensioners." And this right here is the precise moment where a difficult morning became a catastrophic one. Because while Dros Veth was making his decision, Odalys Ferreira Tanaka was making hers. She had been watching the engagement from the colony's old survey post on the northern ridge, running a command net across 18 comm units, coordinating positioning, timing, and resource allocation with the focused economy of someone who had done this for a living. Her assessment, built on 20 minutes of real-time observation, was that the Vorrkai landing force was disoriented, overextended, and falling back toward their landing ships under pressure they hadn't expected and couldn't locate. The logical next step, by standard doctrine, would be to let them retreat, consolidate, and wait to see if they attempted a second landing. Odalis had written some of that standard doctrine. She also knew exactly when to set it aside. "Brecken," she said into her communicator. "Ready," he said. "The landing ships," she said. "Not to destroy them, just make them very uncomfortable to stand near." A pause. The sound of Brecken doing a very quick calculation. "Give me 90 seconds." She gave him 90 seconds. The explosion that walked a precise line across the open ground between 3 of the 6 landing ships was not large enough to damage the ships themselves. It was, however, large enough to be extremely loud, extremely close, and accompanied by enough displaced earth to make 400 already rattled soldiers feel that standing next to their extraction vehicles was perhaps not the safest available option. The Vorrkai landing force, which had been in the process of consolidating near the ships, scattered. Not in panic exactly. These were trained soldiers, but trained soldiers operating with broken sensors in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy of unknown strength and position, who had just been given very clear evidence that the open ground they were standing on was not safe, make different decisions than trained soldiers operating under normal conditions. They moved toward cover. The cover available to them happened to be the directions Thomas had anticipated they would move toward. He had anticipated this because he had walked every meter of this terrain 3 times, and because he had spent 4 decades thinking about exactly these kinds of problems. Celestine came out of the tunnels. Eco brought the drones lower. Priya dialed up her transmitter output another 15%, which pushed 2 of the Vorrkai shock troopers' suit systems into thermal shutdown. And 34 other retired veterans who had moved to a quiet moon specifically to be left alone did what people who have spent careers becoming very good at something will do when someone gives them sufficient motivation to stop being retired. The engagement lasted another 40 minutes. By the end of it, the Vorrkai landing force had lost 63 soldiers, had approximately 140 more in various states of incapacitation, had all 6 landing ships intact but surrounded by terrain that nobody was willing to cross, and had achieved the sum total of 0 tactical objectives. 11 colonists had been injured. Yusuf and Marta Dadashev had already treated 9 of them and were working on the other 2. Yusuf would later say that the most serious injury sustained by any defender was a sprained knee, suffered by a 67-year-old former artillery officer who had moved too fast through a tunnel junction, and not by anything the Vorrkai had actually managed to do. He found this hilarious. Marta told him it was not appropriate to find it hilarious. He found it hilarious anyway. In orbit, Drosveth was no longer having a difficult morning. He had moved past difficult into a category of experience that didn't have a comfortable name. His landing force commander was reporting that extraction was possible, but that the landing zone was effectively contained. His tactical officer was reporting that the colony's defenses showed no sign of degradation. His communications officer had just informed him that Priya's transmitter modifications had, as a secondary effect, been broadcasting on emergency frequencies that were now being picked up by 2 unified accord monitoring stations in the adjacent system. This last piece of information landed on the bridge with the specific silence of something very bad being understood by everyone simultaneously. Pelshu said nothing. He had said his piece. He had been ignored. He was now, very quietly, updating his personal log with a level of specific detail that would be useful if anyone ever needed to establish who had advised what and when. Drosveth stared at the surface feed from the landing zone. He stared at the casualty reports. He stared at the incoming signal notification from the Unified Accord monitoring station, which was asking, in extremely polite and therefore extremely ominous diplomatic language, whether the Vorrkai Dominion could clarify the nature of its current activities in the Cassiver system. He was still staring at this when Odalis Ferreira Tanaka opened a direct communication channel to his command ship. She had, at some point during the last 40 minutes, returned to her administrator's office. She was sitting behind her desk. She had her morning tea finally, and she took a sip of it before the channel fully opened. because she had been waiting for this tea for several hours, and she was not going to let it go cold a second time. "Fleet Commander," she said, "I've reviewed your original transmission. The 48-hour window you provided has not yet expired, which means technically we are still within the time frame of your initial ultimatum, rather than in an active state of war. I want you to understand that distinction because it matters for what I'm about to tell you." On his command bridge, Veth said nothing. "You've lost 63 soldiers," Odalys continued, in the same calm tone she used for everything. "You have more who can't operate effectively. Your landing force is contained. Your sensors on the surface are still dark, and in approximately 30 minutes, the Unified Accord is going to want a formal explanation for why a Dominion fleet is conducting military operations on an unregistered colony world that has now formally filed a distress transmission." She took another sip of tea. "Your landing ships are undamaged and your flight paths are clear. I would like to suggest respectfully that you use them." Silence on the channel. "The Corvinium ore," Veth said finally, and his voice had a quality to it that Pelshu had never heard before. Something his species didn't have a clean word for, but humans might have called the sound of a very large thing deflating. "Is not worth this." "No," Odalys agreed pleasantly. "It is not." The landing ships lifted 40 minutes later. The Vorrkai fleet spent 11 minutes in high orbit, presumably engaged in the specific organizational misery of a force that needs to write a lot of reports it doesn't want to write, and then jumped to hyperspace. They left without the ore. They left without anything except a casualty list, a formal inquiry from the Unified Accord, and a story that would, over the following years, spread through every diplomatic and military channel in the explored systems, with the unstoppable momentum of a narrative too good not to repeat. The Battle of Arvenmoor, as it came to be called, with a title that its participants felt was somewhat grandiose for what was, in their collective assessment, more of a firm message, became required reading in 7 military academies. The tactical analysis was studied. The communication logs were archived. The improvised transmitter design was replicated. The tunnel network layout was diagrammed and taught. Brecken Hollowell returned to his woodcarving. He won a regional competition the following spring with a piece depicting the Arvenmoor landscape that several critics called surprisingly serene, given the creator's apparent history. Eco Salazar Webb registered his drones as an official survey operation, because the events had drawn some regulatory attention to their modifications and spent 3 weeks in mild bureaucratic difficulty before someone in the Accord's licensing office looked at the full file and quietly stamped everything approved without further comment. Priya Vashit received 17 requests from various defense contractors asking to license her transmitter design. She declined all of them because she had not built it for money. She had built it because someone had made her angry, and she was done with it now. Celestine Maboko Rias went back to her tomatoes. They had survived the engagement without damage. She regarded this as the best possible outcome. Tomas Guerrero Lind filled in the tunnel network. He didn't need it anymore, and he had plans to put a vegetable garden in the eastern section. He planted it the following month. Odalys's garden, by coincidence, was immediately adjacent to his across the property line. They had a minor disagreement about where the boundary markers should go. It was, all things considered, a very normal dispute between neighbors. Completely ordinary. Nothing military about it at all. Yusuf Dadashev, who had watched the whole thing unfold from the East Community Hall, and who had the particular perspective of someone who had spent decades keeping track of what humans were capable of when motivated, wrote one line in his personal log the evening after the fleet departed. It read, "They always forget that retired does not mean finished." He showed it to Marta. She read it, handed it back, and told him to come have dinner. He came to have dinner, and on the quiet, lemonade porch garden argument moon of Arvenmoor, life went back to being exactly as peaceful as its residents had always insisted it should be. The Vorrkai Dominion, for their part, updated their pre-operation intelligence protocols to include a new assessment category. It had no official name in their bureaucratic filing system yet, so the junior analyst who created it simply labeled it with the human standard phrase that kept appearing in the after-action reports. The category was called previous occupation. The subcategory beneath it said, wait accordingly, and somewhere, in a small office deep in the Accord monitoring station that had sent that politely ominous inquiry during the engagement, a signals officer who had been listening to Priya's broadcast frequencies during the battle filed a 3-page report recommending that Arvenmoor be reclassified, not as an unregistered colony, as a strategic asset. The recommendation was approved in 6 days, which, for Accord bureaucracy, was essentially instantaneous, and which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously certain people had begun to take a moon full of retirees who simply wanted to be left alone. They had been left alone. They had made certain of it, and everyone who heard the story understood, with the particular clarity that comes from watching something unfold that couldn't possibly have gone any other way in retrospect, that this had always been the only possible outcome. You don't build a quiet life after a loud one by forgetting how things work. You build it by knowing, very precisely, that you could make things loud again if you needed to, and waiting, patiently, for anyone foolish enough to give you a reason.